of the workshop. We're obviously focusing on digital exclusion and raising awareness of the digital divide. And really what I want to do with the workshop, if I can move on actually to my workshop aims. What I'd like to do is focus on sharing experiences of how digital exclusion has affected access to adult learning and education during the pandemic, and compare different national and local experiences from the perspectives of all of you who have kindly joined the session today. But I also want to focus on identifying lessons learned and what are the opportunities now in policy and practice to address digital exclusion in adult learning, building on what we've learned through the experience of the pandemic, and what we are still learning as well, because I think this is a fast moving and evolving field, and where there are obviously a lot of challenges in maintaining access to adult learning opportunities at the moment, but there is also a lot that we're learning from it. So we're actually going to be spending most of the session in breakout groups, and we've got two themed discussions that we'll be having in smaller groups than this, which I'll come on to later on, and we'll give you the technical instructions that you'll need to participate in those breakout sessions a little bit later on in the session. What I wanted to do, just by way of introduction, was to share a few insights from the UK context. So at Learning and Work, we've recently done some research into learning during lockdown, and I wanted to give you a very brief flavour of what we think is going on more broadly in terms of learning during lockdown. And then also I want to share a little bit about a bit from the provider perspective about what the challenges and opportunities are, and very briefly a couple of examples of practice, which, whilst I don't think for a second that we've got everything sorted or even under control, and it's a really challenging time for a lot of providers and a lot of learners as well at the moment, but I just want to share a couple of things that I think might be useful in terms of pointing out the future direction and ways forward, and so on. So let's start with the UK experience then. So very recently, during our Lifelong Learning Week, we published the 2020 Adult Participation in Learning Survey, and the focus this year was to understand whether people used increased time at home during lockdown to learn. It's a very large survey with a nationally representative data set of 5,000 adults aged 18 and above across the UK. And we take a really broad definition of learning, which, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, I won't read it all out, but we have a really wide-ranging, broad definition of learning, which includes formal and non-formal learning as an adult, and whether you do it individually or online or anything like that. We're interested in any and all forms of learning. And what was really interesting, and also to start with the positive, was really encouraging, is that our survey suggests that around 43% of adults, which would be 22 million people, have engaged in learning since the beginning of lockdown in March in the UK. And typically in our surveys, which we do this almost every year in terms of the adult participation survey, typically we've seen over the past decade year-on-year falls in participation of learning, and more recent figures that we get from the survey would be around the sort of 30, 31, 32, low 30s as a percentage of adults participating in learning. Now, the 2020 survey isn't directly comparable with previous years because due to COVID, we had to use a different research methodology. However, it's interesting to see that on the face of it, there is some evidence that suggests that more adults have been engaging in learning during the pandemic. So far, so good. And just to share in a little bit more detail about what that learning looks like. So you can see in terms of whether learning has been online, offline, or a mixture of both. 60% of respondents who have engaged in learning said that their learning was online in some form there. So again, from a point of view of digital inclusion and so on, that would look to be quite positive. Then looking at how learners have learned since the beginning of lockdown, you can see that there are some really interesting trends here. So a lot of people are learning independently and on their own, which may obviously reflect the lack of opportunities to access learning in formal provision or in colleges. So you can see that you know, things like some of those other forms of learning and training are quite low down. Lots of people learning through websites, apps, social media as well. So, so again, you know, on the face of it, this looks an interesting and positive picture. And looking at people's motivations for learning since lockdown as well. We have, as we always see in the participation survey, that lots of people have work-related requirements as a motivation for participation in learning. But I think if you look at some of the you know, slightly smaller categories, but there's a lot of motivation around self-improvement, personal development, personal interests, hobbies, and you know, those kinds of motivations coming out in terms of people's reasons for engaging in learning as well. So not just to do with work, though work remained a strong motivation for many. And then thinking about the barriers to learning, which is kind of where we sort of start to look more at the digital inclusion aspect of it. So a range of barriers identified, some of which will be very familiar, particularly from Ellen's presentation in the plenary at the start of the day, but issues around work-related time pressures. Of course, lots of people have been undertaking childcare and homeschooling responsibilities during this period. But we can see that not having consistent access to a computer or an internet connection was still one of the major reasons or one of the major barriers to learning that was identified in the participation survey. So definitely a challenge there. So I'm going to move on to, so this is looking at learning quite broadly and, you know, all forms of learning. But when we sort of compare and contrast with, you know, so on the face of it, it looks like lots of people are doing lots of different kinds of learning, but it's sort of mainly individual and so on. So if we look at it from what we hear from our provider networks, we can see maybe a slightly different side to the picture. So if I can just move that on. So when we talk to our providers, you know, they've told us about a range of challenges in terms of having to move very quickly to move courses online. They're concerned about the basic digital skills of learners to access an online learning platform, whether that's Zoom like this or you know, an institutional platform like Moodle or something like that. But learners' basic skills were digital skills were identified as a barrier. And then, of course, there are lots of practitioners who didn't necessarily have the skills to move their existing content into an online format, use all of the sort of engaging tools and resources that we're now sort of increasingly familiar with through events like this. And as the academic year now has restarted in September, you know, we are starting to hear that there are, you know, for some kinds of courses, it can be really challenging now to recruit and enroll learners. And a number of providers, I think, are starting to be quite concerned about the numbers of people who are, you know, actually participating, particularly at lower skills levels and those kinds of courses. There's a real challenge there. And you're starting to see learners maybe expressing an interest in a course, but then not being retained on the course or leaving the course early because the barriers are just too great to address. And that really chimes with what our participation survey is saying as well. So if we look at some further findings, which I've just summarised at the bottom of the slide there, we can see that during lockdown, just 1 in 5 adults who left school at the first opportunity took part in learning, compared to 3 in 5 who stayed in education until the age of 21. We know that adults in lower socioeconomic groups were half as likely to take part in lockdown learning, and just 1 in 3 adults who were out of work took part in lockdown learning, compared to over half of those who were in employment. So we can see there some of those inequalities in participation that Ellen talked about in her keynote at the start of the day, very much confirmed there in what we know about the UK experience since lockdown. At the same time, I think it's important to recognise that there have been opportunities and so on arising from the situation. So I think perhaps in contrast to other countries, in the UK, providers have benefited in the last academic year at least from relative stability of their funding, which was guaranteed, which meant that they could keep staff in place to try and deliver learning online, engage with students and support them and so on. There's been therefore the opportunity to experiment and move to new kinds of online delivery, in some cases very, very rapidly, and really, you know, embed online and blended forms of learning, particularly as providers tried to develop models for the current academic year where some learners would come into a learning centre, some learners may be required to access parts of the course at home to try and reduce the numbers of people participating, or sorry, numbers of people in the classroom at any one time, and manage some of those challenges around maintaining space and social distancing. We know that many providers have gone to extraordinary lengths to support their learners with the skills that they need to access learning online, and that's included accessing sources of funding to provide digital equipment, and whether it's phones for homeless adults, whether it's schemes to loan laptops and computers out, whether it's funding to support the digital costs of learning. So, you know, a 1 hour Zoom call like this, I think I heard somewhere, is about 6 gigabytes of data or something like that. So if you're on a Zoom class once a week, and you're on a pay-as-you-go contract on your mobile phone, that's a huge amount of data that you're burning through. So there have been examples of schemes where providers have made funding available through their learning support and other charitable sources of funding to access to boost learners' digital access. And I think finally there's been an opportunity here for providers to highlight some of the wider social outcomes of learning and the value of what they do, not just in economic terms, but there have been there's been a good opportunity to recognise the benefits, some of the social and health and well-being benefits of participation in learning as well, through the opportunities provided to bring people together, and just ensure that people maintain a sense of connection and aren't isolated and lonely during lockdown. And we recently observed a online English language conversation club for one of our projects, and it was really interesting because it was based in London, but actually through people's personal, professional, family, social contacts, there were actually people participating in a London English language conversation club from all over the world, because the participants had invited their friends, relatives, contacts, and anybody who thought that they might be at risk of isolation during lockdown. And the provider had an open door policy, so nobody was turned away, and it was proving to be a really valuable source of connection that people used outside the actual sort of conversation class time as well to keep connected with people. So just a few things to highlight there from the UK. A couple of promising practices that we've seen as in response to COVID. So on the left-hand side, the Keep London Learning campaign has brought together adult learning providers across London to provide an online directory of opportunities to learn online, so that you can see which ones are organised by your local organisations, but you also have the opportunity to see what's going on across the rest of the capital. And that has been positioned very much in policy terms around supporting connection and social connections during lockdown, which I think is really interesting to see. There's also been I think a useful response in terms of professional learning and development of adult education practitioners. And so you can see that our national agency, the Education and Training Foundation, which is the lead organisation for professional learning and development, has been responding to this by offering a program of online content, webinars and so on for practitioners. And you can see the title of that one is very relevant: adapting content to deliver adapting content quickly to deliver online. So you know, I think that there have been some interesting responses which are generally, you know, would be welcome in ordinary times, but particularly important during COVID. So I think those were the main points from me.